The frost had made a glass of the Kettering stable yard, and into that glass she walked at 7 minutes past 8, her father's ledger under her arm, her breath a small ghost ahead of her. She heard the horse before she saw him, a sound not quite a scream, not quite a groan, but something in between, the sound a hinge makes when it has been forced too many times in the wrong direction. 3 men stood at a safe distance from the loose box at the yard's far end, and one of them held a pistol, wrapped in oilcloth, the way a man carries a thing he does not wish to be seen carrying. She had come for £6. Her father had shod every horse on this estate for 11 years before his lungs gave out in November, and the last invoice had gone unanswered through Christmas and into the new year, and a woman with a widowed mother and a leaking roof could not afford to let a debt go soft. She had rehearsed the asking of it the whole 3 miles from the village, polite, unbending, the way he had taught her to speak to men who thought a farrier's daughter had no right to arithmetic. She had not rehearsed for this. The Duke of Rainsford stood a little apart from his men, in a greatcoat the color of wet slate, watching the loose box with the flat attention of a man reading a document he has already decided the ending of. He was younger than the stories made him, the stories that said he had not sat a horse since April, since the fever took his wife in 11 days, and left him a widower before he was 40. He did not turn when the stable boy announced her. He did not turn when she said her father's name. "You've come at an ill time," he said, in a voice that did not rise, that did not need to. "The horse killed a groom's shoulder in January. He'll not have a second chance to finish the work." "I've come for £6, she said, "owed since November." "Then you'll wait." His eyes moved to her then, briefly, the way one notes weather before dismissing it. "This is not a morning for a girl's accounts." She looked past him to the box, where something vast and black was turning in tight, furious circles, throwing its head against the low beam, foam gone pink at the corners of its mouth. The men with the pistol shifted their weight. "He'll not stand still enough to be shot cleanly," she heard herself say. "Not like that." The Duke's mouth tightened. Not anger exactly, something colder, more tired. "He has killed once. He will not make you the second." She set the ledger down on the mounting block and unlatched the gate before anyone thought to stop her hand. The gate swung with a small complaint of iron, and the sound of it seemed to travel the whole yard, so that even the men with the pistol turned their heads, and the Duke's hand came up. Not quite a command, not quite a plea, something caught between the two and abandoned before it finished. She did not look back to see what his face did. Inside, the light was thin and gray, filtered through a high window furred with frost, and the straw smelled of ammonia and fresh blood, where the horse's hooves had opened old scabs on his own forelegs, from turning too tightly, too often, in too small a space. He was larger up close than he had seemed from the yard, a black that was not truly black but the deep brown black of a chestnut gone dark with age, 17 hands if he was an inch, and every muscle in him drawn tight as a wire under strain. He did not charge her. That, she noted, and set it aside to consider later, the way her father had taught her to set aside the parts of a lame horse's gait that did not yet make sense. A horse that meant only violence would have come at the gate the moment it opened. This one backed instead, ears flat, but backed, which was fear, wearing the coat of fury, and fear, her father used to say, is a door if you know which side the hinges are on. She did not speak yet. She let her breathing slow first, because horses read the chest before they read the hand, and she had learned that at 9 years old, holding a lantern while her father worked a colic case through a whole black night in a farmer's shed outside Wem. Behind her, someone said her name in warning, not the Duke, one of the men, hoarse with disbelief that she had come this far. She did not turn. The stallion's eye rolled to find her, white-rimmed, and she saw it then, small and easy to miss, if she had not spent 19 years watching for exactly such things. A wetness at the left corner of the mouth that was not foam, that caught the gray light differently, that had a color foam did not have. She stayed where she was, one hand resting on the top rail, and let the seconds stretch, counting them without meaning to. 1 horse breath, 2, 3. The old habit of her father's trade, patience measured out in the animal's own rhythm rather than the clock's. Behind her, faintly, She heard the Duke's voice again, lower now, almost to himself, as though the words surprised him on their way out. "She'll not get near enough to see it," he said. She was already closer than any of them understood. The rail was cold enough to bite through her glove, and she noted that too, the way her father had taught her to note everything, because a hand that has stopped feeling the cold has stopped feeling much else besides. She did not climb over. She lifted the latch instead, slow, the iron cold and slightly rusted at the pin, and let it fall back against the wood with a small sound that was somehow louder than the men's voices had been. Someone drew breath sharply behind her. She stepped into the stall. The stallion's head came up, ears pinned flat, and for one long moment the whole yard seemed to hold itself still, as though even the frost on the rails had stopped forming. She did not look at the eyes. Her father had told her once, in the shed outside Wem, that the eyes would lie to you before the mouth ever did. A frightened animal wore the same white-rimmed stare as a killing one, and only a fool tried to read intention in a thing built to survive by hiding it. So she looked instead at the shoulder, the way the muscles stood corded beneath the black hide, at the near foreleg cocked in a stance that was not quite rest and not quite readiness, at the lips, drawn back just enough to show the bars of the mouth where the wetness gathered. She spoke without deciding to speak, the way one breathes without deciding to breathe. Low, not words exactly, not yet. A sound her father had made over sick and frightened animals for as long as she could remember, half hum, half murmur, pitched below the register of command. The stallion's ears flicked, once, toward her rather than away. Behind her, the Duke had gone very quiet. She took a step. The straw was matted and dark near the far wall, black with old blood gone dry, and she made herself note that too, and set it aside for later, because it was not this moment's business. 1 horse breath. 2. The animal's weight shifted, hindquarters lowering fractionally, not toward flight, and not yet toward violence, something between the two, something she recognized because she had seen it in a dozen animals brought to her father half mad, with a hurt no one had thought to look for. She reached toward the halter rope where it hung slack from the tie ring, not toward the horse itself, and let her hand rest there a full 10 seconds before she moved it another inch. "She's not to touch the head," the Duke said, and his voice had lost its earlier flatness. There was something underneath it now, some old fear surfacing despite him. "I'll not have it on my hands twice." She did not answer him. She was watching the left corner of the mouth, waiting for the animal to show her, on its own time, what no one in that yard had thought to ask it. The stallion's lip trembled, drew back a half-inch, and stilled again, as if some old habit of pain had checked itself mid-motion. She counted that too. Her father had taught her that animals lied with their bodies only when men had taught them to, and this one had learned its lie recently, badly, the way a child learns to flinch before the hand has even risen. She let her fingers slide from the rope to the coarse hair of the neck, still not the head, and felt the muscle beneath jump once and then, unwillingly, settle. Behind her the yard had gone very still. She heard the creak of a man shifting his boots on frozen ground, the small clink of the harness someone still held forgotten in his hands, the Duke's breath, shorter now than it had been. She did not turn to look at any of it. Looking away from an animal at this stage cost more than it earned. 3 minutes, said a voice from the doorway, the older Groom's, the one who had not wanted her let in at all, and she understood it was not offered as comfort, but as a countdown, a marker against which her failure would be measured. She let it pass through her without answer, the way she let cold water pass over a burn. She moved her hand up along the jaw, slow as a held breath, and the horse's head came round half an inch toward her, not away, and she felt something loosen in her own chest that she had not admitted was tight. There, the eye, close now, showed her white at the rim, but not the wild rolling white of pure terror, something narrower, more particular, a pain located rather than general. She had seen colic look different. She had seen fear of the whip look different. This was neither. "Have you found your genius yet?" the Duke said, low, and it was not quite mockery this time, though it wore mockery's old coat. She heard, underneath the words, the sound of a man who had stood in this doorway many mornings, and not once come farther in. She did not answer that either. Instead, she pressed 2 fingers, light as nothing, along the bar of the jaw where the bit would sit, and the stallion's whole body convulsed backward, a sound tearing out of it that was not quite a scream, and someone in the yard swore, and the older groom said, "Get her out now." And the Duke did not move, and did not speak, and she stood her ground in the settling dust with her hand still raised, because she had felt it, small, hard, wrong, exactly where no bridle should ever cause a horse to scream. She did not lower her hand, she let it hang there in the cold air a moment, the way her father used to leave his fingers resting on a swollen tendon before he said anything at all, as though the stillness itself were part of the diagnosis. The stallion's breath came ragged now, but the eye had changed. The white had gone. The pupil had widened into something almost asking. She noted that. She noted everything. "There," she said quietly, not to the Duke, not to the grooms, but to the horse, the way one might speak to a child who has just told the truth after a long silence. "There it is. There's the whole of it." The older groom had not moved from the doorway, his hand still on the bolt as though he might yet slam it home. "Miss," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier scorn, gone thin with something closer to dread. "You'll want to step back now. He's not done." "He's very nearly done," she said. "He's only frightened of what comes next." She turned her head, slow, and found the Duke watching her with an expression she could not yet name. Not the flat contempt of the yard, not quite belief either, but the particular attention of a man doing arithmetic he did not wish to do. Behind him, the frost was beginning to soften on the cobbles, the sun climbing enough now to draw a thin steam off the stable roof, and somewhere a bucket rang against stone, ordinary and far away. "It is in the bar of the jaw," she said, to him now, plainly, as her father might have laid a fact on a table between 2 men who had been arguing past each other for an hour. "Not the mouth generally, not colic, not temper, here." She touched the same place again, more lightly this time, and the horse did not scream, only trembled, head low, breath coming in short pulls through flared nostrils. Something under the skin, or in it. "You cannot know that from a moment's pressing," the Duke said, and there was less certainty in it than the words wanted to carry. "I can know it exactly that way," she said. "It is the only way I have ever known anything." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of hay gone slightly sour, of leather oil, of the horse's own sweat sharp and metallic, and beneath all of it, something fainter she had caught once before and dismissed. Not blood exactly, not yet, but close to it, the smell of tissue that has been asked to bear more than it should. She held very still, breathing it in again to be certain, and found that she was. "Bring me a light," she said, not loudly, but in a voice that expected to be obeyed, and for a moment nobody in the yard moved at all, as though the sentence itself required translation before any man there could act upon it. It was the groom nearest the tack room who moved first, not because he believed her, but because standing still under the Duke's eye had become its own kind of punishment, and he went at something close to a trot, and came back with a stable lantern already lit, the glass still warm from the kitchen fire where it had been sitting since dawn. He held it out at arm's length, as though the horse might take offense at the light itself, and she took it from him, without looking away from the stallion's head. "Closer," she said, and he did not move. "Closer," she said again, this time to herself, and stepped in, the lantern raised so its light fell along the horse's jaw rather than into its eyes, which she had learned from her father before she had learned her letters, that a light thrown wrong could frighten worse than a blow, but a light thrown right could still a creature the way a hand never would. The stallion's lip was drawn back slightly from the pressure of her fingers earlier, enough that she could see the pale gum beneath, and she brought the lantern nearer still, her own breath held now, watching the way the horse's eye rolled toward the flame and then, strangely, away from it, toward her instead, as though it had already decided which of the 2 lights in that stall was the one that would not hurt him. "There," she said, so quietly that only the Duke, standing just behind her shoulder now, though he had not meant to come so close, could hear it at all. Along the bar of the jaw, where the corner of the mouth folded into itself, the skin was drawn tight and shining, in a way healthy skin did not shine, a small hard swelling, no larger than a shilling, and at its center, barely visible, a line where the surface had broken and closed, and broken again. "That is not a wound from teeth," she said. "Teeth would have torn it wider. This has been made the same way, over and over, by the same small thing." "What small thing?" the Duke said, and this time there was no doubt left in his voice at all, only the flat, careful stillness of a man who suspects he already knows the answer and does not want to be the one to say it aloud first. She did not answer him directly. She set the lantern on the upturned bucket beside her, freeing both hands, and reached, slowly, so slowly that the stallion's ears came forward instead of back, toward the horse's mouth, toward the bit still resting against the raw place, waiting to see whether it would let her touch what all the others had failed to reach. The stallion did not pull away. That, in itself, was a fact worth marking, and she marked it the way her father used to mark facts, silently, filing it somewhere behind the eyes, rather than saying it aloud where it might be argued with. Her fingers found the ring of the bit where it lay against the swelling, and she felt, rather than saw, the horse's breath change, shortening, the great ribs drawing up tighter beneath the black hide. She did not stop. She had learned long ago that stopping halfway was its own kind of cruelty, that a hand withdrawn in doubt taught an animal to fear the next hand more than the last. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been, she thought, for something that had sat so long against living flesh, and when she turned the ring a fraction, no more than the width of a fingernail, the horse's head came up sharply, and a sound left it that was not quite a scream, and not quite a groan, something lower, older, a sound she had heard perhaps twice before in her life, both times from animals that had stopped believing help was a thing that existed in the world. Behind her, someone in the yard swore under his breath and was hushed by another. She did not look round. She kept her eyes on the place where the bit's ring pressed into the wound, and beneath her breath, without deciding to, she began the same low, wandering tune she had used at the gate, the one with no proper words left to it, only her father's cadence, worn smooth as a doorstep from years of use. The stallion's ears flicked toward the sound, not toward her hand, toward the sound. She let a slow count of 10 pass before she moved again, and in that count she felt something shift beneath her fingers. Not the horse's mind, not yet, but the muscle along its jaw, unclenching by some small fraction, the way a fist loosens before a hand admits it was ever making one. "Bring the lantern closer," she said, quiet, not turning, "and hold it still. I do not need light. I need it not moving." She heard the Duke's boots in the straw before she heard him answer, closer than they had been, and the light steadied a moment later, held at the height she had asked for, without being told twice where. She noted that too, and set it aside, unspoken, alongside everything else she was not yet ready to say. The ring of the bit turned another fraction under her fingers. The stallion's eye rolled toward her, wide, dark, and this time, for the first time since she had come through the gate, it did not roll away again. She held that gaze the way one holds a cup too full to move quickly. Something had passed between fear and recognition, and she did not want to spill it. The lantern light caught the wet dark of the eye and threw back a small trembling coin of gold, and she watched it, not blinking, until her own eyes stung with the effort of stillness. Behind her, the men at the gate had gone silent in a different way now, not the silence of men waiting for blood, but the silence of men who did not understand what they were watching and were, despite themselves, unwilling to break it. She turned the ring another fraction. The bit shifted in its channel, and the horse's lip drew back. Not a snarl, she noted, but a wince, quick and involuntary, the corner of the mouth pulling as a man's does when a physician's finger finds the exact tooth. She stopped. She let her hand rest, weightless, against the cheekpiece, and she leaned close enough to smell the animal's breath, sour and warm, and beneath it, unmistakable now, the thin copper thread of blood. "There," she said, to no one, to the horse, to the lantern light itself. "There it is." She did not look back at the Duke, though she felt his stillness sharpen behind her, the way air sharpens before frost. She drew the bit forward by degrees, a hair's width and no more, watching the flinch travel down the horse's neck each time metal dragged against whatever lay hidden beneath the tongue. 6 years of her father's hands teaching her own had left her with this: the knowledge that pain announces itself honestly, if a body is given time enough to speak it. "He has not been striking out at hands," she said. "He has been striking out at pain, wearing the shape of a hand. There is a difference, though I grant you, it does not look like one from where you have been standing." She heard no answer, only the faint creak of the Duke shifting his weight, and she did not require one. She was not speaking to be understood yet. She was speaking to keep her own voice low and even, a thread the horse could follow back from wherever its fear had taken it. The lantern trembled once, his hand, not hers, and steadied again. She drew the bit another fraction, and this time the stallion did not flinch away from her, but toward the wound itself, lips working, seeking the very thing that hurt, the way a tongue cannot help but find a broken tooth. She felt her own breath catch at that small, terrible honesty, and beneath her palm, for the first time, the jaw went entirely still. Stillness, in a creature that size, was its own kind of language. She had learned as a child that a horse gone quiet was not always a horse at peace. Sometimes it was merely a horse deciding whether the next moment required violence or surrender, and so she did not mistake the stillness under her palm for safety. She held it as one holds a held breath, aware that it must end, and worked to see that it ended the right way. The abscess, when she found its full shape with 2 careful fingers, was worse than she had let her voice admit. It ran along the bar of the jaw, where the metal had sat wrong for what she guessed to be months rather than weeks. A wound reopened, and half-healed, and reopened again, each time a hand had reached for the bridle, in innocence or impatience. She thought of the groom's shoulder, the servant's story of teeth and screaming, and understood it now, the way one understands a sentence once the missing word is restored. The horse had not been mad. It had been asked, over and over, to accept comfort into a place that offered it none. "There," she said, quiet, not for the Duke, not truly for the horse either, but for the years of hands that had taught her to say it, her father's, roughened and patient, murmuring the same word over a fetlock gone hot with infection. There, as though naming the trouble aloud made it smaller. Behind her the lantern light shifted again, and this time she heard him move, not forward, not the half-step of a man readying to intervene, but sideways, toward the wall, as if some instinct told him his nearness was a kind of trespass upon what was happening in the straw. She did not turn to look. She could not afford the horse the sight of her attention divided. She began, very softly, the tune her father had used for foals, too frightened to stand for the file, no words worth repeating, only a shape of sound, rising and falling the way rain falls, without urgency, without demand. The stallion's ear turned toward her, then away, then toward her again, testing the sound the way it had tested the pain, honestly, without pretense. She kept her hand where it was, unmoving, and felt beneath her fingers the smallest release, not trust, not yet, but the absence of preparation for harm, which in a wounded animal is very often the first shape trust takes before it has a name. The Duke, in the doorway's cold light, said nothing at all, and she understood that his silence now was not the silence of a man, waiting to be proven right, but of one watching something rearrange itself inside him that he had not given permission to move. She let the tune carry a little longer before her fingers moved again, because a hand that stops singing to begin working undoes in one motion what the voice has spent a full minute building. When she did move, it was only the width of a knuckle, walking her fingers back along the bar of the bit toward the hinge where the metal folded upon itself, where 8 months of pressure had ground a groove into iron that should have stayed smooth. She found it by feel before she found it by sight, a burr, small as a grain of barley, raised where the joint had worn unevenly, catching the soft flesh at the corner of the lip each time the rain asked for anything at all. She thought of her father's hands over 100 such mouths, the patient turning of a bit between finger and thumb before it ever touched a horse, the way he would run his thumbnail along the joint and say a mouth remembers unkindness longer than a back does. Girl, mark that. She marked it now. The stallion's head had lowered by degrees. Not in submission, but in something nearer relief. The great neck no longer braced against expectation, and she understood that what she was hearing beneath the lullaby was the sound of a body that had stopped listening for the next hurt, because, for the length of one song, none had come. Behind her, boots shifted on stone. The yardmen still gathered at the rail, close enough now that she caught the low murmur of one to another, a wager perhaps, or a warning. She could not tell which, and did not turn to learn it. The cold had found its way fully into her knees where she knelt in the straw, and she noted it the way she noted everything useful and nothing else, a fact to be managed later, not now. Now there was only the bit, the burr, the wound beneath it opening its dark line into the pale hair of the horse's lip, and the strange steadying knowledge that she had been right, that no wickedness lived in this animal, only pain wearing the shape other men had mistaken for wickedness, because it was easier to shoot a devil than to admit a mistake made with one's own hands. She did not look toward the doorway to see whether the Duke had understood this yet. She had learned, in 11 minutes that had already stretched longer in her chest than any hour of her life before them, that some men needed to arrive at a truth themselves, walking the whole distance of it unaided, before they would consent to hold it. She kept singing. She loosened the strap another notch, and the stallion, for the first time since she had entered the stall, exhaled, a long, shuddering breath through the nostrils, the sound of something laid down that had been carried too long. She let the strap hang loose against the animal's jaw a moment longer, unwilling yet to draw it free entirely, for she had learned from her father that the removing of a thing that has caused pain must be done as slowly as the pain itself had come, else the body mistakes relief for another assault. The stallion's ears, which had been pinned flat since she entered, came forward, not fully, not trusting, but forward, listening now to the song, rather than bracing against the hands. She sang the second verse, the one about the ewe lost on the long clee, in a fog gone thick as milk, and she thought, distantly, that her father had never explained why that particular verse calmed the frightened ones more than the first, only that it did, and she had never questioned him, the way a daughter does not question the parts of her father that work. Behind her, in the doorway, she heard the shift of weight from one boot to the other, the sound of a man remembering he had a body, that he had been standing rigid as a gatepost for some minutes now. She did not turn. She had learned that too, in service and out of it, that a man watching himself be wrong needed no audience for the watching, only the space to do it in. The wound, uncovered fully now, was worse than she had first judged it. Not a fresh raw thing, but an old one, reopened many times. The proud flesh around it thickened and scarred in ridges, the kind of wound that spoke not of a single cruelty, but of months of the same small cruelty, repeated by hands that never thought to look. She pressed 2 fingers gently below it, testing the give of the tissue, and the stallion flinched but did not rear, did not so much as shift its forelegs, only turned one dark eye toward her, as if to ask whether this too would end in the old way. It will not, she wanted to tell him, though she did not believe animals understood words, so much as the shape a voice made when it meant them. She let the song carry the promise instead. She worked her thumb beneath the last buckle, and felt it give. The bit dropped free into her waiting palm, slick and rust-dark, small enough to seem a foolish thing to have caused so much. She held it without looking at it directly, the way one holds a letter one is not yet ready to read, and became aware, in the same instant, that the shifting weight in the doorway had gone still again, stiller than before, as though the man behind her had seen something in her open hand that she herself had not yet turned to notice. She did not turn at once. There was a discipline to not turning, a discipline her father had taught her without ever naming it so, that the animal must be finished with before the man was attended to, that a horse would forgive almost anything except being made to wait while its rescuer looked elsewhere. So she kept her free hand at the stallion's jaw, kept the low, unbroken thread of the song going, though the words had thinned now to hardly more than breath, and let the blood find its own way down into the straw, dark and slow, the shape of it spreading like ink laid on wet paper. The horse trembled once, a long shiver that ran the whole visible length of him from pole to flank, and then, astonishingly, lowered his head another half-inch, as if some great weight he had been bracing against for months had at last been permitted to set down. Only then did she look at what lay in her palm. It was smaller than she had expected, and worse. The rust was not new rust. It had the particular blackened crust of iron that has sat wet against living flesh for a long season without being drawn and cleaned. The kind of neglect that came not from cruelty exactly, but from men too proud or too indifferent to look closely at a thing they had already decided was ruined. She turned the bit slightly, and the joint caught what little light came through the high window, and she saw, cut faint into the metal near the cheekpiece, a maker's stamp she recognized, not from Kettering, not from any smith in the district, but from a London house whose work she had only ever seen once before, on a bridle her father had been asked to alter, and had refused, saying the fit was wrong before it ever left the shop. Behind her, the stillness in the doorway had become something else. Not silence exactly. She could hear him breathing now, could hear it the way one hears a held note about to break. And when she finally did turn, bit resting flat and open in her palm, as though she were offering it up for inspection, rather than accusation, she found his eyes were not on the horse at all. They were fixed on the small ruined thing in her hand, with an attention so total, so suddenly stripped of the cold ease he had worn in the yard not a quarter-hour before, that she understood, before he spoke a single word, that whatever came next would not be about the animal. "Where?" he said, and stopped. He did not finish it. He only held out his hand, palm up, the way a man reaches for something he already knows the weight of before he has touched it. She placed it in his palm without a word, and the small transfer, metal still warm from the horse's mouth, still faintly slicked at one worn edge, seemed to cost her something she had not expected it to cost, as though she were handing over evidence in a trial she had not known she was conducting until this moment. His fingers closed around it slowly, the way a man closes his hand around a coal he suspects will burn him and picks up anyway. He turned it once. The bar caught the gray light through the stable door and threw it back dull and orange, where the wear had gone through to older metal beneath the plating, and she watched something move behind his face that she had no name for. Not grief exactly, not shame exactly, but some cousin to both, that a man of his rank had likely never been asked to feel in front of a witness. The horse, behind her, had gone quiet in a way that filled the whole barn. Its breath came slow through the split lip of the wound, ragged but no longer frantic, and she was aware of it the way one is aware of a held door, that the calm was a thing she was still, in some sense, holding open with her body between the stall and the yard. He did not look up from the bit. "This maker," he said, and his voice had lost the flatness it wore in the yard, had gone instead to something quieter and more careful, supplies 3 houses in the county, mine among them. He turned the bar again, found the maker's small stamp near the cheek ring, half worn away, but not gone, and his thumb pressed against it, as though he might read it better through touch than sight. "I ordered new tack for him myself, the week I bought him." He stopped again, the sentence hanging unfinished, the way it had hung once already, and this time she understood that the silence was not reluctance, but arithmetic. A man counting backward through months, to a decision he had made and never once returned to examine. The stable boy in the doorway had gone very still, the bucket he carried forgotten at his hip, watching the Duke of Rainsford hold a broken bit, as though it might yet speak to him. She said nothing. She had learned, in 11 minutes, that silence here did more work than any words she might offer, and so she let it stretch. Let him turn the bit a third time. Let the horse breathe its slow, ragged breath behind her. Let the frost outside the door go on melting into mud along the sill, and waited to see whether he would finish what he had begun to ask, or whether, as she suspected men of his kind so often did, he would fold the question away unspoken, and call instead for someone to fetch a fresh bridle. He did neither. He set the bit down upon the upturned bucket beside the stall door, carefully, as a man sets down something he does not trust himself to hold much longer, and looked instead at the horse's mouth, where the swelling had begun already to show its change. Less taut, less shining, the blood thinned now to a dark seam along the lower lip. He had not looked at that mouth in 8 months. She understood this the way she understood the give of a fetlock joint, without needing it said, the way his eyes moved to the wound, and then away, and then back again, testing his own nerve against it, the way a man tests ice before he trusts it his full weight. "You knew it at once," he said. "Not a question. The trouble, you knew it before you went in." "I suspected," she said. "The knowing came after." 11 minutes. "I did not count, sir. Others did." He almost smiled at that. She saw the shape of it pass beneath his composure and vanish before it reached his mouth, the way frost sometimes takes the shape of a leaf and is gone by noon. The stable boy in the doorway shifted his bucket at last, the water inside it slopping softly, and the sound seemed to release something in the yard, some held breath the whole place had been keeping since dawn. Beyond the stall the light had changed. The sun had climbed enough now to reach the high window and lay a pale bar across the straw, across the toe of her boot, across the dulled iron of the bit still resting on its bucket. The horse shifted its weight, testing the leg it had favored, and did not flinch. "He'll want the wound tended," she said. "Salt water first, then honey, if your groom will trust me for it. No bit at all until the swelling's gone. A head collar will do for leading. You give instructions freely for a woman collecting 6 pounds. I give them because no one else in this yard has looked in his mouth in 8 months, sir, and someone ought to have." It was more than she had meant to say, and she heard the edge in it too late to soften. But he did not step back from it as she expected. He turned the bit over once more with the toe of his boot, not touching it now, only looking. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost the arithmetic in it, had gone instead quiet and level, as though he had finally arrived at the sum. "Tend it, then," he said. "I should like to see him eat before dark." He did not say sorry. He did not say thank you. But he did not call for a fresh bridle either, and she understood, watching him turn toward the house without looking back, that for a man like him this was very nearly the same thing. She did not watch him go, though she felt the absence of him the way one feels a door shutting in another room. A change in the air's pressure, nothing more. There was work now, and work was a mercy after the strangeness of standing so close to a man who did not know how to be thanked. She called for salt, and a boy brought it in a chipped tin cup, his eyes wide with the particular awe of the very young for anyone who has spoken plainly to a duke. She mixed it in a bucket with water gone lukewarm from the kitchen, and she worked her fingers gently along the horse's lower jaw until he let her part his lips again, this time without the flinch, this time as though he had already decided, somewhere in the animal privacy of his own mind, that her hands did not belong to the category of hands that hurt. The wound wept when the salt touched it, a thin, dark seep that ran down her wrist and dried there, and she did not wipe it away. She had learned this from her father, who used to say that a man too proud to get blood on his sleeves had no business calling himself a horseman. She worked slow, she worked in silence, but for the low, continuing murmur of the same 3 notes she had been singing since the latch, worn now to something less than a tune, and more than habit, a sound the horse seemed to lean into, the way a man leans into a fire. The groom with the bandaged shoulder came to the door once, watched a long moment, and left again without a word, but she saw, in the corner of her eye, that he had gone not toward the house, but toward the tack room, and came back some minutes later, with a head collar of soft worn leather, the kind kept for foals, and set it just inside the stall door without meeting her eye, as if leaving an offering he was embarrassed to have made. She used it an hour later, when the swelling had gone down enough that the horse would let the strap pass behind his ears, and he stood for it the way a tired man stands for his coat, some of the fight gone out of him not from defeat, but from relief. By the time the light began to slant gold and low across the yard, he had eaten, not much, a handful of scalded bran, but he had eaten, lipping it slowly from her palm, with the caution of a creature relearning that hands could also give. She straightened at last, her back aching, her sleeve stiffened with dried blood and honey both, and became aware, all at once, that the yard had gone very quiet around her, not the quiet of before, when men had stood back from a killer, but a different quiet altogether, one she did not yet have a name for, though she would come, before the week was out, to understand it very well. The quiet held for the length of 3 breaths, and then the head groom, the same man who an hour before had stood with the pistol broken open across his forearm, waiting only for a word, stepped forward, and took the emptied bran bucket from her hand, without being asked, as a man takes a burden from someone he has decided, without discussion, deserves not to carry it any longer. He did not speak. He set the bucket down by the trough and stood a moment looking at the horse's mouth, at the place where the swelling had gone from an angry crimson to a duller, healing pink, and something crossed his face that was not quite shame and not quite wonder, but close kin to both. She became aware, too, of the gate. The Duke had not moved from it in the better part of an hour. She had felt him there the way one feels weather changing, a pressure at the edge of attention rather than a sight, and now, straightening her aching back, she allowed herself, for the first time since she had gone into the stall, to look at him directly. He stood with one hand on the topmost rail, and the hand was not resting there so much as gripping it, the knuckles gone the pale, bloodless white of a man, holding himself in place by main force. He was not looking at the horse. He was looking at her palm, still open, still faintly stained with honey and blood, as though it held something he could not yet bring himself to ask for. She wiped it on her apron before he could ask. It was the ruined bit, still resting where she had set it on the mounting block an hour since, that seemed to draw his eye now, again and again, the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. She had noticed him look at it twice already and look away both times, and she wondered, distantly, whether it was only the horror of the thing, the fouled iron, the dried matter caked along the joint, or whether it was something nearer, something that had not yet risen far enough in him to be named. The stallion, for his part, had begun to doze where he stood, weight shifted onto 3 legs, lower lip loose, the great head lowering by degrees until it hung just above the level of her shoulder, a posture of trust so complete and so unearned that she had to look away from it herself, lest she begin to feel the day's weight land on her all at once. Behind her, the yard had gone on holding its silence, though it was a different silence now than the one that had greeted her at the gate, less the silence of men waiting for blood, more the silence of men who did not know what they had just watched, and were ashamed, in some unpracticed way, that they had been prepared to watch something worse. He crossed the distance to the mounting block without seeming to decide to do it. His boots were quiet on the frozen straw, quieter than a man his size ought to manage, and she thought, not for the first time that morning, that here was someone who had trained himself long ago to take up as little room in the world as his grief demanded, and had simply never stopped. He picked up the bit. He turned it over once in his gloved hand, the iron catching what little sun came slanting through the stable door, and something in his jaw moved that was not quite a wince, and not quite a swallow. "Where was this ordered?" he said. It was not entirely a question. She did not answer at once. She had learned, in 11 minutes, that this was a man who mistrusted quick answers, as though speed itself were a kind of imposition on him, a demand he had not agreed to meet. So she let the silence hold a moment longer, watching the stallion's ear flick once toward the sound of his voice, and then settle, unbothered, back into sleep. "I could not say, Your Grace," she said finally, "only that whoever fitted it did not measure the bars of his mouth before they chose the width. It has sat wrong from the first day it was buckled on him, I'd wager, long before the January business." He did not look up from the bit. His thumb moved along the worn place where the leather had once been stitched, now frayed to threads, and she saw his mouth tighten in the particular way of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to finish. 8 months, he said, so quietly she almost lost it beneath the stamp of a hoof somewhere down the row. He said it the way one might name a date on a headstone, not to inform anyone, but because the shape of the number had to be spoken aloud once, outside his own skull, before he could set it down. She watched him and said nothing, though she understood, with the same quiet certainty she had felt reading the swelling along the horse's jaw, that whatever he had just recognized in his hand had nothing left to do with iron. The stallion shifted his weight, and the girl let her hand rest against the warm plane of his shoulder, feeling the give and take of breath beneath the hide, steadier now than it had been 11 minutes before. She did not press him for more. She had learned from her father that a man confessing something to himself needed the same patience as a horse deciding whether to trust a stranger's hand, that to speak too soon was to close the gate before the animal had chosen to walk through it. He turned the bit over once more, and this time he spoke without the weight of arithmetic in his voice, only the flatness of a fact laid bare. I chose the maker myself, a saddler in Northampton, recommended by my brother-in-law, who swore the man's work was the finest between here and London. He paused. I did not stand for the fitting. I was told it had been done to specification, and I believed it, because I had no wish to stand in a stable yard that week and watch a groom measure a horse's mouth while my wife's linens were still being carried out of the house. The words came out plain, unadorned, the kind of sentence a man says only once and then never again. And Susanna understood she had been given something she had not asked for, not an explanation of the horse, but of the 8 months of an empty stall, of the shuttered window, of a duke who had not ridden since. She did not offer him comfort. It was not her place, and more than that, she sensed he would not have known what to do with it if she had. Instead, she reached for the length of clean linen she had set over the rail earlier, and began, without ceremony, to press it gently against the raw place in the horse's mouth where the abscess had broken. The stallion trembled once, then stilled, his ears swiveling toward her voice as she hummed the last low bars of the lullaby, more breath than tune now. Rainsford watched her hands. Not the horse, her hands, the economy of them, the way she worked, without hurry and without fear, as though the animal's danger had been a fact she'd simply set aside once she understood its cause. It was, she would think later, the first time she had seen him look at anything, as though he were memorizing it. "The bit will need replacing," she said, to fill the silence, though it was not truly for that reason. "A wider bar, rubber perhaps, until the wound closes. He'll not want iron near that mouth again for some while." "No," Rainsford said. "I don't imagine he will." He was still holding the broken bit in his palm when the head groom's boy appeared at the far end of the aisle, breathless, hat in hand, saying that word of the business in the stall had already reached the kitchen, and beyond it, the village. How word of a thing travels, she had learned long ago from her father's forge, not in whole sentences but in fragments, each mouth adding its own weight to what it carried. By the time it reached the kitchen, it would have grown teeth. By the time it reached the village, it would have grown a moral. She had seen it happen with smaller things than a duke's stable yard and a stallion that had put a groom's shoulder out of its socket. The boy would not come closer than the third stall. He stood with his hat crushed against his chest, eyes moving between her and the animal, as though uncertain which of them was the more unnatural sight. "Mrs. Fenn says," he began, and stopped, and began again. "Mrs. Fenn says, is it true the horse let her put her hand in its mouth?" "Tell Mrs. Fenn," Rainsford said, without turning, "that the horse let no one do anything. It endured what it had no choice but to endure, same as any creature in pain endures the hand that finally helps it." His voice carried no heat, but the boy flinched all the same, and fled back down the aisle at something nearer a run than a walk. She said nothing to this. She was still watching the stallion's near foreleg, the way the weight had begun, faintly, to settle back onto it now that the tension had gone out of his jaw and neck. A horse in pain stood wrong long before he bit or struck. The standing wrong was the first sentence of the whole ugly paragraph, and no one in this yard had troubled to read it until now. "He'll want feeding little and often for a few days," she said. "Soft mash, nothing that asks him to grind." She did not look at Rainsford as she said it, only at the horse's mouth, gauging by eye how far the swelling had already begun to ease, now that the iron was gone from it. And no one is to touch that near side of his face without speaking first. He'll have learned to expect the pain from that direction. It will take time to unlearn. "How much time?" Rainsford asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "More than a week. Less than a season, if he's handled right." She straightened, finally, and felt the ache in her knees from having crouched so long on the cold straw, and only then understood how long 11 minutes could stretch when a person stopped counting them. "That will depend rather more on your grooms than on him." Something crossed his face at that, not quite a wince, not quite agreement, and he looked down at the broken bit still resting in his palm, as though it had asked him a question he did not yet have the courage to answer. Behind them, past the stall door, the yard had gone very quiet, the way a room goes quiet, when everyone in it is listening without appearing to. It was Coombs who broke the silence first, and did it the way old men do such things, sideways, as though he had not meant to speak at all. 6 months, he said, to no one in particular, we've been feeding an animal we called Ruined. 6 months of oats and hay, and a man's wages to watch him, and the whole while the answer was sitting in a drawer in the tack room. No one answered him. The stallion had begun, very slowly, to lower his head, testing the new lightness of his own jaw, the way a man tests a tooth after the dentist has gone. He shifted his weight from the near foreleg to the off, and back again, and made a low sound in his chest that was not quite a groan, and not quite content, but something between the two, the sound of a body, remembering it, need not brace for pain at every turn. She kept one hand flat against his shoulder, not stroking now, simply resting there, the way her father used to leave his palm against a horse's flank after the shoeing was done, as if to say, "That is finished, and you are still whole." "He'll want salt water on it," she said, "twice a day, until the swelling's gone entirely. Warm, not hot, and soft feed for now. Nothing that asks him to grind hard against that side." "You'll show them how," Rainsford said. It was not quite a question. "I will show them once," she said. "After that they'll know it, or they won't deserve the horse." A groom near the door, not the one who had been struck in January, but a younger man, thinner, who had said nothing throughout the whole 11 minutes, made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. Rainsford did not look at him, but something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, as though one weight among many had been set down. He turned the bit over once more in his hand, the metal catching what light came through the high window, and she watched him study the place where the joint had worn thin and sharp, worn by nothing more than months of use against tissue too soft to bear it. He had ordered this. She had not said so again, had not needed to. The knowledge sat visibly on him now, in the set of his jaw, the way a debt sits on a man who has just understood its size. "You'll want your gloves," she said quietly, nodding at the ruined leather still lying where he had dropped them. "The straw here won't stay dry past noon." He bent for them without a word, and she noted, she could not help but note, that he did not straighten immediately, that he remained a moment longer at the level of the horse's knee, as though something there required his attention beyond the leather in his hand. The stallion did not startle at his nearness. That, too, she noted, and filed away, the way her father had taught her to file away every small fact that might later prove to matter. The stallion's ear turned toward him, not away, and Susanna watched that small motion the way she had once watched her father read a limp, as a sentence written in a language most people never troubled to learn. The horse had killed a man in January. The horse had also, in this moment, chosen not to move from a hand it had every reason to fear, and she understood that the animal's memory, like her own father's ledgers, kept better accounts than most men gave it credit for. He straightened at last, the gloves recovered, but not yet worn, and stood with his weight settled oddly, favoring some old ache she had not been told of, and would not ask after. The grooms at the door had not moved either. She noticed that too, how the whole yard had gone still around this one stall, as though the frost outside had crept in and fixed everyone in place until some verdict was rendered. "He'll need the wound dressed twice a day," she said. "Morning and evening, until the swelling goes down and stays down. Salt water first, then honey if you have it. Comb honey, not the boiled kind the shops sell." She said it plainly, the way she would have told a customer the price of a shoeing, and she saw him absorb it as instruction rather than suggestion, which was, she thought, the only way a man like him could accept correction without feeling it as one. "And if it does not go down? Then you'll know within the week, and you may do as you please." She did not soften this. There was no kindness in pretending a wound might heal, simply because one wished it to. Her father had taught her that lie killed more animals than any disease did. He nodded, once, and looked past her to the horse's mouth, where the raw place still showed pink against the dark hide, already less angry than it had been an hour before, though whether from the salt water or from the mere cessation of the bit's constant pressure, she could not yet say. Time would tell that, as it told most things, slowly and without argument. "You knew this before you came in," he said. Not quite a question. I knew there was a reason. I did not know it would be this one. She wiped her hands on her apron, the linen already stiffening where the water had gone cold against the February air. A horse does not turn killer for no cause. Men like to believe otherwise, because it is easier than asking what they might have done to make him so. He did not answer that directly. He set the gloves over his arm instead, and glanced once more at the ruined bit still resting in his palm, as though weighing whether to keep it or discard it, and in the end, he closed his fingers over it, and said nothing at all, which she took, rightly or not, as its own kind of answer, the kind a careful man gives when he has not yet decided how much of the truth he can afford to say aloud. The stallion had gone quiet in a way the yard had not seen since before Michaelmas. Not the slack quiet of exhaustion, but something nearer to trust. His weight settled evenly on all four legs, his ears no longer pinned but turning, loose and curious, toward the sounds of the morning. The grooms who had stood back against the far wall throughout the whole business began, one by one, to find small tasks that brought them nearer the stall door, though none yet dared cross the threshold. A boy of perhaps 14, whom she had not noticed before, stood longest of all, watching the horse, with the particular stillness of someone rearranging what he had believed to be true. He bit at Tompkins in November, the boy said at last, to no one in particular. Took a piece of his sleeve clean off. We were told he was born wrong in the head. He was born no different than any other horse I have shod, she said, not unkindly. He was made wrong by a piece of iron and 8 months of men who would not look in his mouth before they blamed him for what was in it. The boy said nothing further, but he did not move away either, and she understood that this was, for a groom raised on the Duke's word as law, its own small rebellion. The Duke had stepped back from the stall while she worked the salt water through a second time, and he stood now near the tack-room door, with the ruined bit still closed inside his fist, watching the horse the way a man watches a debt he has only just learned he owes. He did not offer to hold the horse's head. He did not offer to help. He watched, and in the watching, there was something she recognized from her own father in his last winter, the particular attention of a man counting a cost he cannot yet name aloud. "He'll want walking," she said, "twice a day, on a plain head collar, no bit at all, until the mouth has closed over clean. A fortnight, perhaps 3 weeks in this cold. After that, we may speak of a snaffle again, and I will fit it myself, or no one will fit it at all." "We," he repeated. Not a question this time either, but something closer to a man testing the weight of a word before he decided whether to set it down or take it back. She did not answer that. She had learned, in a life of small debts and smaller mercies, that a man like this one answered his own questions eventually, in his own time, and that pressing him toward the answer only taught him to withhold it longer. The frost on the cobbles had begun, at last, to soften into a thin, dark wet beneath the climbing sun, and somewhere beyond the yard wall, a bell rang the half-hour, 10 o'clock, though it felt to her that whole days had passed inside those 11 minutes, the way grief or fever will stretch a single hour past all reasonable measure. She gathered her father's kit, wiped the blade once more, and did not yet leave. The Duke stood a moment longer with the ruined bit still in his palm, turning it as a man might turn a coin whose face he no longer trusted, and then he did an odd thing, a small thing, the kind of thing that would mean nothing set down in a ledger and everything set down in memory. He crossed to the rail where the halter hung and took it down himself, rather than calling for the boy who had been hovering near the tack room since sunrise, pretending to coil a lead rope he had already coiled twice. He held it out to her, not pressed it into her hands, only held it, so that she must reach for it, so that the choosing remained hers. "You will want a second person for the first 3 days," he said. "The mare in the far paddock is quiet enough. He knows her voice, I think. He has always gone easier when she is within hearing." It was, she understood, as close as he had yet come to admitting that he had watched the horse closely enough, in the 8 months of his absence from this very yard, to know such a thing, that his not coming had never meant his not knowing. Grief did not always look like distance. Sometimes it only wore its clothes. She took the halter. Her fingers, still faintly reddened from the cold and the work, brushed his for the length of a breath, no more. and neither of them remarked upon it, though the boy by the tack room looked away with the sudden, studied carefulness of someone who has decided a thing is none of his business and means to prove it by watching nothing at all. "He'll want feeding by hand a while," she said. "Soft mash, no oats yet, nothing that asks the jaw to work hard against itself. I can show whoever you set to it." "Set to it," he said, as though trying the phrase for wait, or you. She did not answer that either. But she did not look away from him this time, and something in her stillness answered more plainly than words could have done, that she had already understood, before he had finished asking, what it was he meant to offer, and had not yet found the shape of the sentence to hold it. The stallion, behind them, blew softly through his nose, and lowered his head to the fresh straw she had laid, and for the first time since January, he did not flinch at the sound of a boot upon the cobbles. The yard had gone quiet, in the particular way a place goes quiet after a fever breaks. Not silent, but easier. The ordinary noises of buckets and hinges and a dog somewhere barking at nothing, returning by degrees, as though the whole stable yard had been holding its breath alongside the horse, and only now remembered how to let it go. She latched the stall door softly behind her, and stood a moment in the thinning frost, waiting, though she could not yet have said for what. Rainsford turned the ruined bit once more in his palm, as a man might turn a coin whose value he had only just learned, and then he did what she had not expected of him. He crossed the yard to the tack room and hung it, not on the hook where the working bridles waited, but on a nail beside the door, where it would be seen by anyone who entered. He said nothing of why. She understood it well enough. It was to be a lesson kept in plain sight, the way her father had kept a cracked hoof-pick nailed above his forge for 11 years, so that he would never again reach for the wrong tool in haste. "The £6, he said at last, "are owed you, and shall be paid within the week." He paused, and the pause held longer than the sentence itself had. "But I would not have you leave this yard for £6. She waited. "I have no farrier fit to judge a horse's mouth from its manner," he said. "I have grooms who fear this stallion, and a bailiff who would sooner see him shot than puzzle out why he bites. I am offering you the running of the stables, full charge of every animal in it, and wages beyond what your father was ever paid in a year, though I know that is a low measure to set beside what you have done this morning." He looked, briefly, toward the stall, then back. "I cannot say the rest of it yet. I find I have not the words that would do it justice, and I would rather owe you a debt of silence than pay you in poor coin." It was not a declaration. It was not even, quite, an apology. But she had spent enough winters reading the small tremors of frightened animals to know when a creature, man or horse, had gone as far as its nature would presently allow, and she did not press him further. "I accept the position," she said, "on the understanding that no bridle enters this yard again without my hand upon it first." "Agreed," he said, and something in his face, some old locked door, stood very slightly ajar. She did not offer her hand, and he did not offer his. It was not yet that kind of morning. But when she turned to gather her father's kit from where it lay in the frost-whitened straw, he stooped without being asked, and lifted the leather roll himself, and carried it as far as the gate, where he set it down and stepped back, as if he understood that the last few feet of any road belonged to the one who had walked it. The stallion, behind them both, had begun at last to eat. Years afterward, when the yard at Kettering was spoken of in the county, for its horses, and for the woman who kept them, and, more quietly, for the Duke who was rarely seen anywhere else, no one who told the story could say precisely when the debt of £6 had been paid, or in what coin, only that a ruined bit still hung by the tack room door, and that no one, not even the Duke himself, had ever taken it down.